Shalom and thank you all for joining us today. I'm Advocate Uri Morad, the Director of JIJ's International Law Department. The Jerusalem Institute of Justice is a pro-Israeli legal and research institute. JIJ's International Law and Public Diplomacy Department utilizes legal and advocacy tools in order to secure the legitimate standing of the State of Israel among the international community. JIJ is dedicated to promoting and protecting human rights all across the region. We will talk today about the intricate relationship between Israel and the United Nations over the last 70 years. So what is actually the United Nations? Who are the subsidiary bodies who work in underneath? The United Nations mission statement is the maintenance of international peace and security, and the UN's bodies are 6. Today, we're going to focus on 3. The UN General Assembly is the organ who serves as the main deliberative, policymaking, and representative organ of the UN. The UN Security Council has the primary responsibility for international peace and security, and the UN Human Rights Council is responsible for promoting and protecting human rights around the world. I want to start our time together today with some startling statistics. From 2012 till the end of the decade, the largest intergovernmental organization in the world, whose goal, I remind you, is to promote and maintain international peace and security, the United Nations, has issued 202 condemnations in order to express its displeasure at the human rights atrocities occurring in the world. Of these, 163 condemnations were against the only democracy in the Middle East, the State of Israel, while the number of condemnations addressing all other countries of the world were only 39. There's no doubt these are alarming numbers. With devoid of any sense or logic, they are simply an expression of an anti-Israeli alliance and a political determination to delegitimize Israel and undermine its international standing. For those who just joined us, let me present myself again. I am Advocate Uri Morad, the Director of International Law and Public Diplomacy Department at the Jerusalem Institute of Justice. I'm very happy to be here with you today, live from Jerusalem. So as we said, we are dedicating this time to analyze the relationship between the State of Israel and the largest global human rights platform, the United Nations. During the 70 years of Israel-UN relations, much ink has been spilled on the disproportionate preoccupation of the UN with Israel. This hostility is not a matter of subjective feelings, and it's not a matter of paranoia. It can be easily seen through objective landmarks. Due to our time restraints, we will examine today together 3 central time periods which illustrates well the developments of this relationship. The first period I would like to address covers the years from 1945 to 1949, during which Israel's independence was declared and great efforts to be accepted to the UN have been made. So actually Israel's relationship with the UN began even before the establishment of the State of Israel. And it comes and started with the influence of the Jewish Agency back in 1945. That year, the San Francisco Conference was held, and it dealt with the creation of a new international body. The United Nations, or the UN, stepped into the shoes of the previous body, the League of Nations, which has dissolved at the beginning of World War II. The San Francisco Conference became a diplomatic arena for the struggle between the Jewish Agency. Back then, it was the organization which represented the rights of the Jewish people prior to the founding of the State of Israel, and all the Arab delegations on the other side. We're now moving forward 2 years to November 29th, 1947, and to the success of the Jewish Agency. On this day, the UN General Assembly Resolution 181 was adopted with 33 states voting in favor, 13 against, and 10 abstaining. Resolution 181, also known as the Partition Plan, was proposed by the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine and recommended the solution to the Jewish-Palestinian conflict corresponding with the end of the British mandate in the region. This special committee appointed by the General Assembly and recommended the establishment of 2 separate states, one for the Jews and one for the Arabs. Both states, according to the plan, were to maintain a common economy, and Jerusalem, according to Resolution 181, was to be an international area under UN control and was not included in the territory of either state. Though the plan wasn't implemented or wasn't fully implemented, it was a decisive step towards the establishment of a Jewish homeland and a victory for the Jewish advocacy in the aftermath of the Holocaust. While most Zionist movements welcomed the partition plan, the local Arab leadership opposed the international recognition of Jewish rights to establish a sovereign state. Along with the neighboring Arab states, they announced that they would not accept the partition plan and in fact intended to oppose it, even by military force. Demonstrating this attitude, the representatives of the Palestinian delegation stated that the line of division will be nothing but a line of fire and blood. Less than 6 months have passed, and on May 14, 1948, the last day of the British mandate, Israel declares its independence. Undoubtedly a very exciting event in the history of our country. That same night, 5 Arab armies invaded the borders of the newly born state, and Israel, which paid dearly, succeeded in overcoming its enemies in a miraculous way in the War of Independence. December 11, 1948, UN General Assembly Resolution 194 was received. Resolution 194 created the United Nations Conciliation Commission in order to facilitate peace between Israel and the Arabs, but instead laid the groundwork for a series of future disputes in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It consisted of the United States, Turkey, and France, and was supposedly a balanced commission with France on the side of Israel, Turkey on the side of the Palestinians, and the United States on the role of the neutral party. The commission was a complete failure. One of the tasks the Conciliation Commission was tasked with is to submit a detailed proposal for permanent international oversight of the Jerusalem area and to discuss Jerusalem's status. According to the proposal, Jerusalem would be divided into 2 autonomous sections, Jewish and Arab, which would be able to create infrastructures for urban management only, ruling out any possibility of Israel making Jerusalem the sole capital of the new Jewish state. The proposal of the Conciliation Commission on the issue of Jerusalem has received harsh criticism from all the international community, but especially from Israel and from Jordan as well. Most of the attention in the context of Resolution 194 is directed specifically to Article 11, which discusses the issues of refugees and states as follows. Refugees wishing to return to their homes and live at peace with their neighbors should be permitted to do so at the earliest practicable date. The refugee issue stands at the heart of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and will certainly be at the center of any future settlements between the parties. The main controversy surrounding Article 11 lies in its interpretation. While the Arab side sees it as an anchor for the Palestinian claim to the right of return, according to the Israeli interpretation, Article 11 does not establish any explicit right of return for the Palestinians because it's only a general outline. Israel maintains that it has the complete autonomy and the legal right to decide which refugees to accept, when to accept them, as well as the manner in which these decisions will be implemented. On May 11, 1949, Israel becomes the 59th member of the United Nations. Israel's acceptance to the UN was made possible following the UN Security Council's determination that Israel is a peace-loving country capable of and interested in fulfilling all the obligations contained in the UN Charter. Only 5 months earlier, by the way, Israel's request to admit was denied. For Israel's first Prime Minister, David Ben-Gurion, it was a priority to become a member state of the UN. It was the expression or the fulfillment of the Zionist vision, the acknowledgement of a state with a stable Jewish majority, a democratic country that grants equal rights to non-Jews, seeks peace, and has the important and legitimate role in the international media. The architects of the accession were then Foreign Minister Moshe Sharet and the young Israeli ambassador to the UN back then, Abba Evan. On the eve of the decision, the tension on the Israeli side was enormous. It was at its peak. The fear stemmed mainly from the fact that the Arab opposition was enormous. The irony of the Arab fury is the claim that Israel has expanded its borders beyond what was outlined in the partition plan. That was the same plan that they themselves opposed it, strongly opposed it. The Arab efforts were not successful, and Resolution 273 passed by a 2/3 majority. The vote in General Assembly being 37 in favor to 12 against, with 9 abstentions. One historic and memorable picture is of Moshe Sharet and Abba Evan hanging a big Israeli flag in front of the UN building and smiling from ear to ear. Mission completed. We now take a look at our second time period and addressing the 1970s, which set new lows in Israel-UN relations. The 1970s were marked by the deterioration of Israel's standing at the UN. But actually, before we dive right in, it's important to mention one more significant resolution, and it's Security Council Resolution 242 from November 20th, 1967. Resolution 242 from 1967 came after the Six-Day War, which began on June 5th, 1967, and resulted in an Israeli victory and an expansion of its borders by occupying Sinai, the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights. The annexation of Jerusalem drew a series of condemnations from the General Assembly, as well as from the Security Council. Resolution 242 called for the withdrawal of all Israeli armed forces from territories occupied in the recent conflict. At this time, I will not go into an extensive legal explanations, but I will say that this decision is not binding and not enforceable because Israel is still under attack, a constant attack by its neighbors. Israel's position is upheld under Chapter 7 of the Security Council, which addresses threats to peace, breach of peace, and acts of aggression. Worth mentioning is the fact that Resolution 242 is still of a great significance even today, as it is the legal foundation for the Israeli-Palestinian negotiations. But let's go back now to the 70s. The 70s were loaded with historical events that influenced the UN-Israel relations. One of them is the horrific massacre of the 11 Israeli athletes who were victims of the Palestinian terrorists at the 20th Olympics held in Munich, Germany in 1972. Many years have passed since the terrible massacre in Munich, and yet it is still remembered as a trauma for us. It was a painful event that's still considered one of the most well-known terrorist attacks in the history. An interesting anecdote about the Munich attack or about the Munich massacre is the fact that one of the people that were responsible for financing the attack was none other than the current chairman of the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas. JIJ has already acted against Abbas last year as part of the proceedings before the International Criminal Court at The Hague. A year later, and the Yom Kippur War broke out, perhaps the most painful event in the history for us. It was a war in which over 2,200 soldiers were killed. A war that led to the resignation of the first woman to hold the complex position of the Prime Minister of the State of Israel, Golda Meir. In this state of affairs, one extraordinary decision was made, one that breaks all the rules, one that redefines what hostility is. It occurred on November 10th, 1975, when the UN General Assembly passed Resolution 3379. The resolution stated that Zionism is a form of racism and a racial discrimination. Zionism, by the way, is the nationalist movement of the Jewish people with the goal to establish a Jewish homeland in the land of Israel. The former Israeli ambassador to the UN, Chaim Herzog, is the former sixth president of the State of Israel as well, delivered a fiery response speech in which he accused the UN of racism and anti-Semitism towards the State of Israel. I personally think that if today we retrospectively analyze the most problematic decisions of all UN decisions in history, and undoubtedly there are too many, this without any doubt be the greatest insolence of all. Resolution 3379 was another step in a series of anti-Israeli diplomatic measures by then the Soviet Union and Arab states together allied to expel Israel from the UN. Thankfully, this attempt failed. Eventually, the UN reversed Resolution 3379 by publishing Resolution 4686, and I must say it was probably the shortest to be drafted in history. But the decision was reversed, but the disgrace will definitely remain forever. 1 year later came the scandalous condemnation by former UN Secretary General Kurt Waldheim regarding Israeli military action of rescuing 105 Jewish and Israeli passengers abducted by Palestinian and German terrorists back in 1976. Waldheim condemned Israel for a legitimate counterterrorism hostage rescue mission called Operation Entebbe, and even described it as an act of aggression. Entebbe's story illustrates beautifully how such a biased body against one country can turn a heroic rescue of 105 innocent passengers into an act of aggression. I'm convinced that if you take the name of Israel out of this story and replace it with any country you choose, it is very likely that the same action would have been praised. And on a personal level, and as a former combat soldier at the IDF and someone who was often been in real danger, I cannot even imagine how we dare to say such offensive things about those who risk their lives in order to rescue innocent victims. By the way, Waldheim is the same Waldheim who during World War II served as an officer in the Wehrmacht units known for committing war crimes. On March 19, 1978, the UN Security Council adopted Resolution 425 calling on Israel to withdraw its forces from Lebanon. Israel was forced to enter southern Lebanon. It was in order to eliminate active Palestinian terrorist infrastructures. The straw that broke the camel's back and brought Israel to action was the coastal road hijacking and massacre in which 38 Israelis, including 13 children, were killed. Resolution 425 brought the establishment of the United Nations Interim Force into Lebanon, or UNIFIL. UNIFIL was created in order to create a peacekeeping force in the area. Although UNIFIL was a success in their mission to rescue or to reduce the infiltration of terrorists through the northern border, it resulted in a massive rocket fire which led to the 1982 Lebanon War. It seems that the promotion of security and peace, the same inspiring and important values engraved on the UN flag, are not reflected when it comes to the security of Israel and the security of its citizens. We have now reached the third and last period we are addressing today, and want to address the 21st century. The appalling condemnations that characterized the UN's approach towards Israel in the 1970s were joined by a number of equally scandalous resolutions in the following 2 decades. These resolutions include, inter alia, a series of condemnations after the first Lebanon that broke out in 1982, and the new wave of condemnations as a result of the 1987 Intifada that was a violent Palestinian uprising that resulted in the death of more than 150 innocent Israelis. And thus, the UN proves again and again that the same values in which it was founded are not implemented when it comes to Israel. For Israel, the UN actually develops a unique terminology, a hostile approach, and a double standard. The beginning of the Second Intifada and the failure of the Israeli-Palestinian negotiations in mid-2000 led to a further deterioration and erosion of the Israeli status at the UN. With the advent of the 21st century, the UN began to serve not only as a platform for constant condemnations against Israel, but also as a platform platform for actualizing a new Palestinian diplomatic strategy against Israel. This strategy was characterized by attempts to delegitimize Israel as an apartheid regime through international isolation. The catalyst that led to the formulation of this new approach took place during the UN Conference Against Racism and Xenophobia, also known as the First Durban Conference, held in South Africa under the auspices of the United Nations in September 2001. The Durban Conference was supposed to present an international front against racism and xenophobia, but in reality became a horror show of delegitimization of Israel. Despite their status as observers, many nonprofit organizations managed to hijack the agenda of the Durban Conference, and they set the tone for it. Narratives from the 1970s were repeated. These included accusations of Israel being an apartheid state, and therefore the countries that have ties with it should be isolated and even condemned. Despite the fact that there are close to 20 Arab representatives in the Israeli parliament, prominent representation of Arab doctors in hospitals, and Arab professors in prominent universities all across Israel, the anti-Semitic voices that took part in the conference continued to promote a false narrative and accuse Israel of being an apartheid state. Moreover, these organizations have cynically used the world's largest human rights platform in order to promote a narrative that says that Israel commits war crimes, Israel commits crimes against humanity, genocide, and even possess danger to world peace. I'm sorry, but it cannot get more absurd than that. This new strategy is sought to promote an anti-Israeli bloc and promote denormalization of Israel with the world. And indeed, this strategy bore fruit when many countries refused to promote diplomatic relations with Israel. However, Israel refused to remain passive and has established its own tactics. Israel's new tactics rest on the changing the familiar paradigm that Israel must first reach an agreement with the Palestinians in order to pave new channels of relations with Arab world. These days, we are witnessing the culmination of this perceptual change. Israel peace agreement with the United Arab Emirates is undoubtedly historical. Recently, many other countries, Arab countries, have also expressed their desire to establish official relations with Israel. And by the way, just a few days ago, Kosovo, alongside with Serbia, announced that they will open an embassy in Jerusalem. Worth mentioning in this regard is also Israel's success in recruiting Germany, which was very important, I have to say, to stand by its side in the proceedings that are being formed against Israel in the International Criminal Court in The Hague, and alongside strengthening the Israeli-Indian relationship as well, there was a great relationship, great enforcement as well. All of this signals to the Palestinians and all the neighbors in the region that Israel is a player that cannot longer be ignored. Very important. The UN's biased approach towards Israel in the years since the Durban Conference has not changed, and one can easily argue that it's even intensified. Thus, in 2004, the UN, through legal acrobatics, succeeded in turning a security fence designed in order to prevent terrorism into a separation wall. The security fences became a constant object of condemnations by the General Assembly, and on July 2004, the International Court of Justice in The Hague issued its advisory opinion on the legality of the security fence at the request of the General Assembly. The International Court of Justice proved in its published opinion that the infringement of the freedom of movement of Palestinians outweighed the value of innocent Israeli lives. Even the movements of those Palestinians who specifically expressed their desire to murder Jews simply because they are Jews. In a 55-page opinion, which includes a harsh criticism of Israel, the court ruled that the fence is illegal and that it considered it as an illegal annexation. Among a host of controversial statements, the tribunal said that the wall could not be justified by security reasons or because of demands of national security and public order. The decision in the court was made by a majority of 14 out of 15 judges of the court. But actually, the true story behind this highly charged political decision can be told through the statements of two judges. One is the Egyptian judge Nabil al-Arabi, who admitted in his decision that the court's conclusion reflect the goal of the international community. And the other was the American judge Thomas Burgenthal, who admitted that the court never seriously examined the nature of attacks against Israel and its citizens, and that the court's conclusions are not merely legal sound. Following the incessant firing of rockets from Gaza, from Hamas actually in Gaza, the IDF launched Operation Cast Lead in December 2008 with the aim of destroying terrorist infrastructures in order to prevent harm to innocent people. In response, the United Nations Human Rights Council appointed an investigation team headed by Richard Goldstone in order to examine the IDF's conduct during the operation and Hamas's conduct that actually led to the operation. In September 2009, the Goldstone Commission published its conclusions. Goldstone reports was distinctly one-sided and was riddled with misrepresentation of the truth. The committee refused to treat Hamas as a terror organization. I remind you, a designated terror organization recognized by a lot of countries. The report ignored important facts in the way that undermines the credibility of the entire report. The sources of information and the manner in which these events were presented were a blatant violation of any legal foundation and lacked basic fairness. As expected, the UN Human Rights Council accepted the Goldstone report, confirming actually that when it comes to Israel, even willing to support terrorism. Due to our time limit, I chose to skip a few years straight to the beginning of the new decade, to the most recent disgrace with the UN giving up any subterfuge and acting directly against Israel. On the 12th of February 2020, the UN Office of the High Commission for Human Rights published a database of 112 companies purportedly operating in the disputed territories. Worth mentioning in this regard is the fact that many of these companies provide essential services to the Palestinians. The only way for these companies to avoid being blacklisted would be for them to end operations in Israel altogether. As such, publishing this list is an attempt to generate a full-scale boycott of Israel. The database is punitive in nature, with the express purpose of pressuring businesses that operate legally to cut economic ties with the disputed territories, only as a first step for the full-scale boycott of the Israeli economy. The Human Rights Council has acted beyond its authority by publishing a sanctions mechanism against Israel. And let me be very clear in this point. Under Article 41 of the UN Charter, the Security Council, and only the Security Council, has the authorization to impose such sanctions on a UN member state. Now it's a good time to briefly talk about the UN Security Council, perhaps the most important of the 6 main organs of the UN. This is where UN resolutions drafted regarding peace and security issues, and those resolutions has actually legal implications. The Security Council is actually charged with ensuring international peace and security, and the powers vested in it includes establishing peacekeeping operations, enacting international sanctions, and authorizing military actions when it seems fit. The Security Council is actually consisted of 15 members, with 5 founding members having permanent status. These 5 members or permanent members are the United States, Russia, United Kingdom, France, and China. Each of the 5 permanent members holds a veto power. Under an ongoing atmosphere of hostility towards Israel stands Israel's most valuable ally, the United States. Over the years, the United States has sided with Israel dozens of times and alone has prevented a series of anti-Israel resolutions in the Security Council. The tool by which the United States stands alongside Israel at the United Nations, called the Nakoponte Doctrine, which was established by the United States ambassador to the UN, John Nakoponte, back in 2002. According to this doctrine, the United States will oppose Security Council resolutions concerning Israel, the Israeli-Palestinian conflicts, of course, that condemned Israel without also condemning terrorist groups as well. In order to bypass the Security Council, the anti-Israel bloc uses the General Assembly as a weapon against Israel. Let me close with this, please. The state of Israel, as of today, faces a dilemma. This dilemma regards how should Israel handle her relationship with the UN. And there are actually two possible opposite strategies. One argues that in light of the clear and unequivocal bias, Israel must reduce its involvement in the UN, just as it did recently with the withdrawal from UNESCO. The second approach believes that precisely due to the same bias, Israel must increase its involvement through attempts to run for official positions in the organization's ranks. This channel is gaining a lot of momentum recently, and actually in an era in which Israel is investing a lot of efforts to establish official diplomatic relations with many countries around the world, including Arab countries from all over the region. Normalization of relations with the United Arab Emirates and a potential normalization agreements with other countries are a step in this direction. So actually the 3 points I would like you to take with you from today's session is as follows. First is that the UN's approach towards Israel is characterized by double standard, bias, and hypocrisy. 2, over 80%, again, over 80% of all UN's condemnations are addressing one country, Israel. Third, last but not least, is the fact that the United Nations systematically fails to address human rights atrocities due to its obsession with Israel. And now I want to talk with you a little bit about how can you actually advocate and support Israel. We need you guys. So it all starts with informing yourself. Informing yourself and actually pass it on as well. JJ here in Jerusalem, the staff of JJ dedicates thousands of hours in order to uncover the truth behind the disgraceful treatment that Israel receives from the UN. And we shed light on the inability of the UN's ability to actually properly deal with the atrocities taking place all over the world. These materials are for you. We produce them for you. So follow us, read, ask questions, and pass it on to your friends, to your family. Pass the knowledge, because knowledge is actually equals power. Get involved as well. It's very important. Get involved. Join our campaigns. Join JIJ's campaign. We promote human rights in the region. Join us. Sign our petitions. Share our letters and take part in our polls. Last but not least, I want you guys to please share an accurate narrative. Take Israel out of the victim's role and start promoting a different, proactive narrative. One that presents a democratic, law-abiding state that grants equal rights to all of its citizens. Say it loud and spread the word. Okay? Very, very important. And we ask you to take actually this opportunity to ask you to donate to JIJ. We use your funds wisely to pursue justice in Israel and all across the region. So thank you all for joining us today. I hope it was good for you and it was nice for me as well. If you have any questions, please feel comfortable to send us your questions via email. You can see my email here. And thank you all for joining us again.